And thank you for that fascinating survey of the historical past, which doesn't have a direct bearing on the subject, but it's fascinating nevertheless. I'm delighted to be here at the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution. It sort of trips off the tongue, doesn't it? In such elegant surroundings and distinguished company. My appreciation to...
Excuse me a second, can everyone hear properly?
Not very
Oh, could you turn the volume up? He's not with us.
Maybe I'll just speak a little louder, will that do? Fine. I want to express my appreciation to everyone involved for the invitation, and thank you all for coming. It was very noticeable how there was such a congenial atmosphere in the room until we've started, and I hope that we will somehow manage to retain that congeniality right through to the end. So it'll probably be a record. I hope this doesn't sound too discourteous, but I want to begin this evening by lamenting that I'm here at all. The tragic conflict between Palestinians and Israelis should have been, and I believe could have been, ended years ago, in the turbulent century that gave birth to it. It doesn't really belong in the 21st century, which has its own challenges and burdens. The question before us today, as reflected in the topic of this talk, is less how to resolve the conflict and more whether it is resolvable at all. That this issue has climbed to the top of the agenda is a sad commentary on the way things have panned out. But then again, have they panned out? Are they still not panning out? And might the pendulum not swing again as it has often done before? What I propose to do this evening is take a brief look at the swing of the pendulum, consider whether the outlook really is all gloom and doom, or whether there are some grounds for hope that may be exploited. Bring into the mix some historical perspective, share with you some of my own experiences, impressions, and ideas acquired over some decades of involvement on both sides, and end with some proposals about what I think may now be done at the international level to enhance the prospects of finally reaching a peace agreement. I suppose the region we know as the Middle East has been a roller coaster of hope and disappointment in recent times. We can all recall the great joy and expectation just 4 years ago, when the peoples of the Arab Middle East rose up in country after country in protest of the corrupt and dictatorial regimes that have governed their lives for decades. Inspired and led mainly by the youth of the region, male and female, there were lofty expectations that these long subjugated populations would at last enjoy the offerings of freedom and democracy. Yet in every country that experienced an uprising, with exception until now of Tunisia, the situation today is dire. Countless numbers have suffered horrific deaths and mutilations, and millions of new refugees have been created. Egypt is more autocratic than ever, and Syria, Libya, and Yemen are suffering extreme civil strife, might be on the verge of breaking up, and together with Iraq are subjected to the routine terror of brutal jihadi groups, including the self-proclaimed Islamic State and assorted Al-Qaeda affiliates or would-be affiliates. The atrocities, as we unhappily know, have infiltrated other regions and countries of the world, including our own. Expectations had also been raised in the part of the Middle East region that is our particular focus this evening, Israel-Palestine, by the newly installed President Obama in September 2010, less than 5 years ago, when he inspired the UN General Assembly with his talk of securing the Middle East Middle East deal. Within a year, he said, that would lead to a new member, Palestine, being welcomed into the World Organization. Alas, it did not work out that way. But some 3 years later, the indefatigable US Secretary of State John Kerry declared that the aim of the Israeli-Palestinian talks he was about to revive was to end the conflict once and for all and bring into being an independent Palestinian state alongside Israel, this time within 9 months. The 9 months passed with no deal. The talks ended in acrimony, with Israelis and Palestinians blaming each other and calling for retribution. Within 3 months, it duly arrived with a vengeance, when hostilities erupted once again over Gaza, the third time in 6 years, trailing a path of death and destruction. To the already fragile hopes for peace, a further blow was apparently delivered just last month when the hardline Likud party, headed by Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, won a convincing victory in the Israeli election on a platform of no Palestinian state on his watch, implying the indefinite continuation of Israel's rule over the West Bank. Many experts saw the election result as the last straw and have concluded that the conflict is impervious to resolution. It is possible they are right. But they will definitely be right if we allow ourselves to be so consumed by the obstacles that we fail to divine the potential opportunities, assuming there are any. So we need to look beyond the fog of despair and see if we can find any cracks in the wall. I think I have detected 4 silver linings, each of which provides, arguably, a ground for hope. If you believe you can add to them, think about it, and please let us know during the discussion session. My first ground for hope is, paradoxically, the collapse of the bilateral talks. The second ground, equally paradoxically, is the results of the recent Israeli elections. I shall return to explore these 2 paradoxes presently. The third ground, in the wake of Netanyahu's pre-election pledge to rule out a Palestinian state, was the announcement by President Obama that his administration would be re-evaluating its attitude towards Israel's approach to peacemaking. His announcement was not exactly a bombshell. The backcloth was a steady dampening of US-Israel relations on Netanyahu's watch. Post-election, the Israeli Prime Minister sort of recanted his pledge of no Palestinian state, but the damage had been done. It is unlikely there will be a dramatic change in US-Israel relations in the near future, but there is talk of the US reconsidering its practice of routinely vetoing every UN Security Council resolution to which the Israeli government objects. The ramifications of such a move should not be underestimated. Potentially, it could lead to the endorsement of a firm deadline for Israel to end its occupation, which the Palestinians have been pressing for. It could also open up the possibility of Palestine being admitted to the United Nations as a full member state. At the moment, they are an observer state. This eventuality, a full member state, would leave Israel with its military bases in the West Bank in the invidious position of being in daily violation of the sovereign territory of an independent UN member state. In many respects, Israel's legal position would become a nightmare. My fourth crack in the wall, more tenuous perhaps than the others, but telling nonetheless, I think, takes its cue from the miserable record of the Commentariat, myself included, full disclosure, to anticipate in advance almost every seismic shift in the Middle East in contemporary history. What venerable expert foresaw the seminal Arab-Israel War of 1973, or the dramatic Sadat Initiative 4 years later, when the Egyptian president flew to Israel on an unprecedented peacemaking mission? Who saw coming the first Palestinian Intifada, or uprising, in 1987, or the Israeli-Palestinian Oslo Accord in 1993, or the second Palestinian Intifada in 2000, or the sudden uprooting by the Israeli government of all Israeli settlements in Gaza in 2005, or the 2006 election victory of Hamas, or the Arab uprisings in 2011, or the tearing apart of Syria, the effective disintegration of 3 other Arab states, and the rise of the so-called Islamic State. The soothsayers have been caught unawares time and time again. So let's not be too certain it won't happen again. This conflict has a habit of surprising us, and this alone provides grounds for hope. As some doors shut, others have a habit of unexpectedly opening. To return to my first silver lining, the breakdown of the Kerry-led talks. The popular view is that this is a major, possibly irretrievable setback to peace. But this view rests on the assumption that the talks were in principle capable of reaching a successful conclusion. But in my view at least, and not only mine, there was no basis at all for this conviction, other than wishful thinking, a common and powerful force in this conflict, by the way. The long-standing fantasy throughout the protracted negotiations process was that there was a nucleus of goodwill on the part of both parties, and that they shared a principal commitment to a common outcome that they were also capable of delivering. These assumptions might have had some grounding during the period of the Oslo Accords in the 1990s, but they've had almost no purchase since those heady days. The unwarranted premise of goodwill has all along fatally precluded the vital need for a robust enforcement mechanism, whatever the plan. Some gentle coaxing was thought to be sufficient. Among others, I've been banging on about these deficiencies since at least the turn of the century. This century, I mean. What has been particularly frustrating was not just that the negotiations were manifestly phony and incapable of achieving their stated aim, but that they were blocking out more apposite approaches to peacemaking. An array of original proposals from various sources have appeared and disappeared over the years, but you have probably never heard of most of them, as they were all shunted aside by the phantom of the negotiations train. I was intimately involved with some of these proposals, 2 of which I shall use to exemplify the general point. 12 years ago, in May 2003, I put forward a proposal in conjunction with the Oxford Research Group that called for a 3 to 5 year international protectorate or trusteeship over the West Bank and Gaza Strip, pending full Palestinian independence. The explicit premise of the proposal was that restarting negotiations was pointless. The paper maintained that other than effective capitulation, there was nothing the Palestinians could offer a right-wing Israeli government that would satisfy its territorial ambitions and ostensible security needs in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, or its wider political and ideological agenda. Equally, the paper argued, the Israeli government had nothing to offer the Palestinians that would come close to meeting their minimum aspirations for an end to occupation and independent statehood. Therefore, the paper concluded, renewed negotiations would almost certainly founder, and yet more time would be frittered away. But the protectorate proposal, which had high-ranking advocates in the United States too, never received a serious hearing because decision-makers were insensible to alternatives to bilateral negotiations. At present, I'm not pushing the idea again myself, but I gather there is talk in some circles of possibly reviving this proposal. In a pamphlet published 6 years later, in May 2009, shortly after President Obama started his first term, I put forward a different proposal that also required firm international leadership. I shall elaborate the proposal later, as I believe it has returned to relevance. At the time, we had hoped that the new US administration would give it serious consideration, and there were some initial indications of this. But the hope soon evaporated on the familiar altar of bilateral negotiations. Entitled Visions of the Endgame, the proposal rested on the same explicit premise regarding their futility. There are some copies sitting here on the desk. Next to some other copies, actually, of a pamphlet I wrote just a couple of years before that called How Peace Broke Out in the Middle East, A Short History of the Future. And it described how it happened. The only flaw in it is, of course, that it didn't. The pamphlet, Visions of the Endgame, argued that attempts to revive what it called sham negotiations between the reluctant parties, or actually to build trust between an occupying authority and an occupied people, were a waste of time. It advised against replicating what it called the drawn-out methods and repetitive errors of previous efforts. Failure this time, it warned, would effectively close the door on hope and bring the alternatives of endless strife perilously close. Well, the sham negotiations were revived, the old methods and errors were replicated, and they have indeed brought us perilously close to the point of endless strife. I believe the record is a strong indictment of international diplomacy. Now that the train to nowhere has at last come off the rails, the way might be clearer for more promising and imaginative proposals to get a hearing. So this is why I hold that the collapse of the talks is more a matter to welcome than lament. It is unleashing a buzz of creative ideas from different sources. I'll come to some of them presently, some new ones and some old ones revised and refashioned. My remaining ground for hope in the set of four was the recent Israeli elections. I imagine this too raised a few eyebrows, so let me explain. There is a widespread impression that Israeli voters swung decisively to the right in the election, further complicating future peacemaking efforts, if ever the international community was seriously to get its act together. The good news, such as it is that the swing was actually in the opposite direction. What has misled people is that the right-wing Likud party of Prime Minister Netanyahu has substantially increased the number of seats from 20 to 30 in the 120-seat Israeli parliament, the Knesset, giving it a decisive victory over the more left-wing Labour's 24 seats. And if I can do this technology, how about that? So there you have an illustration from the right and the ultra-orthodox to the centre and the left of the centre. A closer look at the figures reveals that the voters who flocked to Likud at the last moment were from the two parties further to the right and from the two ultra-orthodox religious parties that are considered to be Likud's natural allies, although of course it's never as simple as that. While Likud itself gained 10 seats, you can see at the top, the further right and religious parties together lost a total of 14 seats, giving a rise to a net loss of 4 seats by the right religious bloc compared to the previous election 2 years earlier. The loss was very costly, as it meant that the 5 parties in this bloc, Likud, the 2 to the right and the 2 ultra-orthodox, won a total of 57 seats, exactly 4 short of the critical 61 seats majority needed to govern without having to pull into the coalition a party from the centre or the left. It is still uncertain what coalition government will emerge from the ongoing negotiations among the parties, but should it be formed as expected from the right religious bloc, plus the new centre party Klug with 10 seats, in the centre, it will be inherently unstable. This will be all the more so since there is strong friction between the far right parties and the religious parties, and little regard by any of them for Netanyahu. So there is no certainty that the new government will survive the full 4-year term. This could again mean early elections, or if Klug were to choose at any time to switch allegiance, an alternative coalition government, headed by Labour, possibly could be cobbled together. In either case, the trigger could be serious inducements by the international community to end the occupation and the conflict. In sum then, far from the election results being a solid barrier to outside pressure, they could be more of an invitation to build up the pressure. The other interesting development in this election was the emergence of what is known as the Joint List. You'll see that at the very bottom. An amalgam of three mainly Arab parties which had run separately in previous elections. There was a fear that at least two, if not all three, of those parties, which draw their support predominantly from the Palestinian citizens of Israel, would fail to meet the new minimum requirement of 3.25% of the national vote to take their place in Israel's parliament, up from 2% in the preceding election. For clarification before I go on, Palestinian citizens of Israel, sometimes also referred to as Israeli Arabs, comprise roughly 20% of Israel's 8.3 million population and have the right to vote in and stand for the Knesset. This is in contrast to the 2.7 million Palestinians who live under Israel's rule in the occupied West Bank. Go back to that. There is the West Bank. The occupied Palestinians, the 2.7 million Palestinians who live under Israel's rule in the occupied West Bank, do not have rights to vote or to stand for elections to the Knesset because they live in occupied territory. Roughly 1.7 million Palestinians inhabit the Gaza Strip, just there, on the Mediterranean coast, ruled by Hamas. So to continue where I left off, the change in the percentage threshold from 2% to 3.25% for election to the Knesset had been promoted by one of the far-right parties, that one to be precise, Israel Our Home, Israel-Palestinian, led by Lieberman, precisely to keep the Arab parties out of the parliament. But instead, it inspired them to come together and form one electoral list under a young charismatic leader, Ayman Odeh, that fired the imagination of their potential supporters and drew considerably more of them to the voting list than for many years. In the event, the joint list polled 10.5% of the votes, capturing 13 seats, two more than their combined total in the previous election. You could say that indirectly, two of the four seats lost by the right religious bloc, including by the party that initiated the percentage change, ended up in the mostly Arab bloc. So there's another little irony. The joint list is now the third largest party in the Knesset, after Likud and Labour, and potentially a political force to reckon with. This could have a positive influence in the future, internally on improving the plight of Arab citizens of Israel, and externally on future peacemaking between Israel and the Palestinians at large. With these four qualified rays of hope firmly in mind, I want to move on shortly to the possible strategies the international community could now adopt following the failure of bilateral negotiations. But before we talk strategy, we need to be clear about goal. Strategy without a clearly defined goal has no ultimate purpose. But in order to talk goal, we need to have a basic grasp of what historically lay at the root of the conflict. I won't go quite as far back, Martin, as you did. What makes the parties tick? What is the minimum that each could live with? Leaving our own predilections and prejudices at the doorstep, not an easy task, we need to feel the humanity of both peoples and acquire these fundamental insights from the inside if we want to make informed judgments about what may advance a practical and sustainable resolution of the conflict. I believe we in the West, in particular, need to be wary of our own unconscious cultural biases and our historical instincts to impose on the peoples of other lands our preferred values, systems and political inclinations, whether they emanate from the right, the centre or the left. The one-size-fits-all approach of here's a solution, where's the problem, has caused mayhem around the world for generations, and some of it has been blowing back on us in recent times. In the early 1970s, when as a younger man, I embarked on my doctoral thesis on the Israeli occupation of the West Bank, I had in mind to write a short, objective history of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict as the opening chapter. My meticulous supervisor cautioned me about the imperatives to stick scrupulously to the facts, to be neutral and balanced in my approach and assessments, and not to be influenced by the strong emotions and passions of either side. I set out to do as he had advised, but soon recognised that the task was impossible, and that the only way to make sense of the facts and get to grips with what was firing both sides was to see the conflict as the protagonists see it, subjectively, through their eyes, each in turn, with all the imbalances and emotion and historical traumas left in. I came to realise there is no one history of the conflict to tell. There are two peoples and two histories, which clashed on the same piece of territory at the same period of time. What then are these two core perspectives? Let's take a quick empathetic look at the essence of each in turn, without fear or favour. Chronologically, it makes sense to start with an Israeli-Jewish perspective and move on to a Palestinian-Arab perspective, so that is what I will do. The underlying case for a Jewish homeland was strikingly, if inadvertently, put by the poet Lord Byron as far back as 1815, when some of the worst tragedies to face the Jewish people, including the Tsarist pogroms and the Nazi Holocaust, still lay a distance ahead. This was several decades before Theodor Herzl, the founder of political Zionism, was a twinkle in anyone's eye, and a full century before the Balfour Declaration of 1917, with the promise by the British government of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, the land of Israel, the birthplace of the Jewish people. In his Hebrew melodies, Byron, who was not Jewish himself, wrote, the wild dove hath her nest, the fox his cave, mankind their country, Israel but the grave. By Israel, of course, he meant the Jewish people. Once the Zionist movement eventually came into being, however, all sorts of conspiracy theories and malevolent intent were soon fastened onto it by its detractors, some of it giving off a familiar anti-Semitic whiff, not so different from that which played the decisive role in winning so many Jews and others to the Zionist cause in the first place. Conceptually, Zionism was a distressed people's proud, if defiant, response to centuries of contempt, humiliation, discrimination, and periodic bouts of murderous oppression. The Israeli state was the would-be phoenix to rise from the Jewish embers still smouldering in the blood-soaked earth of another continent. The underlying purpose was the affirmative one of achieving safety and justice for a tormented people, not the negative one of doing damage to another people. Yet, in the attempt to rectify the enduring Jewish calamity, the reality, as we step out of one pair of shoes and step into the other, is that damage was inflicted on another people, on the luckless Palestinian Arabs who paid a heavy price and are still paying it. In common with their Arab brethren in neighbouring countries and other colonised peoples, the Palestinians had long yearned for their independence, free from foreign rule, only to find that in their case another people, mostly from foreign parts, was simultaneously laying claim to the same land. Naturally, the Palestinians resisted. Any people would have resisted. In their place, Israelis most certainly would have resisted. The Palestinians, in like fashion, did not set out to damage anyone, but aspired to what they felt was rightfully theirs. Displaced, dispossessed, and deserted, they were among the principal losers in the geopolitical lottery that followed the horrors of the Second World War. The figures are disputed, but around the time of the First Arab-Israel War of 1948, roughly 750,000 Palestinians, out of a total of some 900,000, fled their homes in fear of their lives. Naturally, they did not want to flee, and many of them did lose their lives. You could say the Palestinians bore the knock-on consequences of Nazi atrocities. Their original felony was, in essence, to be in the way of another distressed people's frantic survival strategy, fueled by an industrial genocide for which the Palestinians bore no responsibility and played no part. Virtually everything that has happened since then is in some way a consequence of all this. This tragic historical clash, the product of centuries of virulent European anti-Semitism at home and rampant imperialism abroad, crowned by double, or in this case treble, British-French dealings, is the root of the conflict. Almost everything else has been grafted on retrospectively. Self-serving explanations of the type that portray either people as innately wicked or falsify their histories, or disparage their sufferings do not in any way aid understanding of the problem. They merely confound the issues, deepen the hatred, and poison the air. The core case for each side stands proud in its own right. Neither one is invalidated because the other side also has, in its own terms, a compelling case. Imagine how different their attitudes towards each other might have been if their aspirations had not collided on the same piece of territory. Even so, what should be clear is that this is not a zero-sum conflict. Although both sides tend to measure their advances in terms of the setbacks to the other, this is folly and ultimately self-destructive. Neither people is going away, and in the end both of them will enjoy their places in the sun, or neither will. They are fated to live alongside each other. But any suggestion of symmetry falls apart, not just on the ground that one side has a sovereign state and the other does not, but also because the existing sovereign state is physically in occupation of the land and lives of the other. Like any occupation, the Israeli occupation corrupts relationships. It would be no different if the boot were on the other foot. Occupations brutalise the occupier as well as the occupied. And inevitably they are resisted and foster violence. This is probably one of the few cast iron laws of history. Thus, ending the occupation is the sine qua non. No end of conflict is possible without this. But wouldn't this mean endangering Israel's security? A fear frequently expressed by Prime Minister Netanyahu among other Israeli politicians, particularly from the right wing. Not according to more than 100 retired Israeli generals and intelligence, security and police chiefs in an ad placed in Israeli newspapers last November, in which they urged the Israeli government to bring the occupation to an end as its highest priority within the framework of a peace settlement with the wider Arab world, which they regarded as realistic. They proclaimed this not to be a question of right or left, and warned against political blindness thwarting the opportunity. This was a powerful plea by top security experts for the Israeli political leadership to demonstrate the will to solve the problem and leave it to Israel's celebrated ingenuity to find a way to withdraw from the bulk of the West Bank without jeopardizing its own legitimate security needs. In the real world of today, where in practical terms does this all leave us? Drawing on the analysis in the opening chapter of my doctoral thesis, I concluded that the only way to resolve the conflict between the two peoples was the creation of a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza Strip alongside Israel. I put forward this proposal, also published in the 1973 Fabian pamphlet, some copies of which are also there, because it seemed blindingly obvious from my own research, travels and personal engagements that both peoples overwhelmingly wanted their own state and were not prepared to settle for anything less. I could not see any other way of accommodating and reconciling these common, basic, minimum, irreducible aspirations. More than 40 years on, during when the national imperatives have, if anything, hardened, I still cannot see a plausible alternative to what has somewhat misleadingly come to be termed the two-state solution. Even if there are more formidable obstacles today in the way of its fruition than in the early 1970s. I refer in particular to the huge growth of the number of Israeli settlers now living in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, from fewer than 5,000 at the time of my initial writing to an estimated 580,000 today. Over the last 4 decades, the two-state formula has steadily acquired strong global backing and become the firm international consensus. The PLO formally adopted the paradigm in 1988 at its Congress in Algiers, following years of agonized internal debate. The immensity of this move should not be underestimated. It was a hard pill to swallow, as it meant lowering Palestinian rights from the hitherto immutable demand for 100% of the land and accepting a scaled-down state on the remaining 22%, comprising the occupied territories of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, with East Jerusalem as its capital. A two-state outcome was adopted as official international policy by way of a UN Security Council resolution in 2002, the same year, in fact the same month, as the 22-member Arab League issued the Arab Peace Initiative that envisaged a comprehensive regional peace deal based on two states, total reversal of their position in 1967 of the famous three no's: no peace, no recognition, no negotiation. This was promising peace, negotiation, and full recognition and diplomatic relations. In 2009, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu declared that he was willing to support the creation of a Palestinian state, even if his commitment was heavily conditioned. Opinion polls consistently reflected more than two-thirds support for the two-state idea among both Palestinians and Israelis. More recently, however, support appears to be receding among both peoples. But this can be misleading, because for one thing, there is no consensus on an alternative. People talk loosely of a one-state solution, but have very different takes on what that would mean. And whatever it means, it would entail starting all over again in terms of attracting the support of national governments around the world and international agencies. From my soundings, right-wing Israelis who use the one-state term mean, in essence, a Jewish state in which West Bank Palestinians would in principle have some rights. Palestinian supporters of one state, with some exceptions, mean in essence an Arab state which would include the full right of return for the roughly 4 million original refugees and their descendants. I think the number is actually larger than that, and in which Jews from the former Israel, as it then would be, would in principle have some rights. Hamas means a Muslim state with in principle lesser minority rights for non-Muslims. Secularists outside the region mean a unitary, democratic, secular, non-sectarian state in the image of Western-style states. There are other designs too, including federal, confederal, binational, cantonal and multi-confessional models. For the most part, these diverse ideas are ill thought out, unrealistic and often contradictory. No less importantly, they are regarded as deeply threatening by most people from one side or the other. There are strong indications that national allegiances in many parts of the world continue to have an important appeal to many people. This is particularly well exemplified in the case of a grouping as close as Benelux, in which the constituent states of Belgium, the Netherlands and Luxembourg have, despite their closeness, still retained their official independence and separate identities. Optimistically, a confederative arrangement along the lines of Benelux could be a possible future template for Israel, Palestine, and maybe Jordan. But confederations comprise independent states which volunteer to give up some of their sovereignty to a supranational authority for common benefit. An Israel-Palestine-Jordan link-up without Palestine first attaining sovereignty would not be a confederation, but an Israeli-Jordanian condominium over Palestine. The apparent decline in Israeli and Palestinian support for two states is partly because people on both sides are losing faith in it as a practical proposition. There is good reason for this. But I fear that it is also partly because of a common growing illusion that a deal based on mutual recognition is no longer necessary. There is a danger that we are returning to an earlier era when both sides rejected the national aspirations of the other because they are no longer convinced that they need to recognise and accommodate the other people's national rights in order to attain their own. On the Israeli side, there appears to be a growing perception of the Palestinians as weak and divided, and that after nearly 50 years of Israel ruling the West Bank, they will have to accept their fate as a defeated people. The Palestinians, on their part, have seen a dramatic shift of international sympathy from the Israeli side to the Palestinian cause, which has fueled the belief among some of them that they don't, after all, need to come to terms with the Israeli reality, as time will take care of the problem. So they too are loosening their allegiance to the two-state idea. But there is a fundamental fallacy here. The two-state idea was never based on support for it by the two peoples. Indeed, it was conceived at a time when there was little or no such support by them. The idea was predicated on the zeal of each people for their own state. There is no discernible evidence that I am aware of a reduction in this sentiment on either side, or any prospect of it in the near future. Probably the contrary is true. Indeed, if the Palestinians were offered their own genuine state tomorrow alongside Israel, it is almost certain that they would overwhelmingly jump at the opportunity. Other considerations apart, they are in desperate need of a guaranteed refuge from the persecution, massacres and expulsions they have periodically been subjected to in one or another Arab state during times of turmoil, most recently in Syria. At different times it has been Jordan, Lebanon, Kuwait and Iraq. The two-state idea would lose its force only if both peoples, or at least one of them to begin with, no longer sought self-determination in their own state. Until such time, it remains the only plausible option, even if it is of declining feasibility. That, to my mind, is a vital distinction between plausibility and feasibility. You don't need to get to the feasibility test if the concept is not even plausible. This is the rub. It seems to me that the most likely alternative to two states by design is not the utopian vision of one united, harmonious state, but two states by disaster. What do I mean by that? Should all avenues to the peaceful birth of a Palestinian state through agreement ultimately prove for whatever reason, to be dead ends, the situation is likely to move into a phase of perpetual conflict, which may give birth to a Palestinian separatist movement on the West Bank, with the potential to develop into a full-blown insurrection, probably marked by violence and counter-violence, atrocity and counter-atrocity, and will all take sides. Eventually, it might culminate in the emergence of a bedraggled Palestinian state alongside an isolated Jewish state. The two-state solution will, in a sense, have come about, but through chaos, not consensus. So if a state for each people, ideally with close ties and open borders, remains the only plausible basis for resolving this conflict, what strategies may advance this goal in place of failed bilateral negotiations? Before we get to possible international strategies, it may be useful to consider the actions the Palestinians themselves are pursuing or contemplating at present. In a nutshell, they include seeking recognition of Palestinian statehood by other parliaments and governments, a campaign which, by the way, is actively supported by an expanding group of eminent Israelis, pressing the UN Security Council to set a deadline for ending the Israeli occupation and lay down the parameters of a Palestinian state, calling for a temporary international presence in Palestine, urging the EU to take action against the settlements and settlers, up to a total ban on their produce and their freedom to travel within the EU, and making it illegal for EU nationals to invest in the settlements. Joining the UN specialised agencies, pursuing Israeli officials for alleged war crimes at the International Criminal Court, and supporting the boycott, divestment and sanctions campaign at one level or another. In this connection, only last week, hundreds of Israelis signed a petition addressed to the international community to impose an economic and cultural boycott on the settlement's enterprise, despite such expressions of support having recently been made illegal in Israel. If these measures prove to be unsuccessful, the Palestinians may consider supplementing them with scaling down or ending security cooperation with Israel, dissolving the Palestinian Authority, and promoting non-violent civil unrest. An important consideration for the Palestinians is the risk of some of these actions rebounding on the Palestinians themselves, but the major challenge facing them is to transform a formidable wish list into a coherent strategy with an unambiguous goal. To move on to the concluding part of the talk, what path or paths could the international community now take in place of bilateral negotiations to expedite the end of conflict? I want to present to you two possible strategies. The first is a proposal conceived jointly by the Palestinian-American thinker and business executive Sam Bahor and myself, published exactly a year ago. The proposal takes as its starting point the need to resolve a fundamental ambiguity at the heart of Israel's control of the West Bank and blockade of Gaza, encapsulated by the key question, is it or is it not an occupation? The entire world thinks it is an occupation, and therefore considers the Fourth Geneva Convention and other relevant provisions of international law to apply. Successive Israeli governments have disputed this on technical historical grounds, which I won't go into at the moment, while claiming that they do observe most of the provisions. In practice, this legal ambiguity has served the occupying power well, allowing it to cherry-pick the Geneva Convention as suits its purpose. In its eyes, it is not an occupation when it disregards the provisions that forbid annexing and settling parts of the captured territory. But it is, in effect, an occupation when it shields behind the clauses that prohibit altering the legal status of an occupied territory's inhabitants to justify treating them differently from Israeli citizens. The second question is, at what point does an occupation, with its connotation of temporariness, cease to be an occupation and become a permanent or quasi-permanent state of affairs? After nearly 48 years, has that point been reached? Our submission is that the occupying power should not any longer be able to have it both ways. Rather, the laws of occupation should either apply or not apply. If it is an occupation, it is beyond time for Israel's provisional custodianship to be brought to an end. If it is not an occupation, there is no legal justification for denying equal rights to everyone who is subject to Israeli rule, whether Israeli or Palestinian. Our proposal is that the Israeli government should be put on notice that by the 50th anniversary of the occupation, it must make up its mind definitively one way or the other. A half a century is surely enough time to decide. This would give it until June 2017 to make its choice between relinquishing the occupied territory, either directly to the Palestinians or possibly to a temporary international protectorate in the first instance, or alternatively granting full and equal rights to everyone living under its jurisdiction. To be clear, this is not a call for a unitary state. How Israelis and Palestinians wish to live alongside each other in the future is for them to decide, not us. The point of our proposal is to bring into sharper focus the political and legal ambiguities surrounding the occupation and to compel a decision. Should the Israeli government not go for the first option of withdrawal, the international community will be free to hold it accountable to the benchmark of civic equality pending an eventual agreed solution to the conflict. A refusal to accede to either demand amidst growing international pressure could lead to an unsettling future for Israelis of increasing isolation and a pariah status as the country tries to fend off accusations of apartheid. The hope is that this prospect would spark off new political currents, culminating in the election of a new government ready to agree a genuine two-state compact with its Palestinian neighbours. The Arab Peace Initiative, for which there has been polling evidence of growing support among the Israeli population, might offer the best framework for such a deal, as urged by the retired Israeli generals. The appropriate agency to initiate this proposal could be the UN General Assembly, or more ambitiously the Security Council, but before bringing it to these bodies, it would be useful to build a momentum through governments around the world, country by country, making the simple public demand of Israel to declare whether it regards its rule as an occupation or not. If an initial few governments, maybe one or two from each region of the world, were to instigate the campaign, others could be induced to follow in a sort of bandwagon effect. Civil society could be encouraged to exert pressure on their governments to pose this question where necessary. By and by, we also, my Palestinian colleague and I, observe that Palestinians suffer discrimination all over the Middle East, and we argue that in the modern era there is really no justification for continuing their limbo status pending a final settlement. In almost every Arab state, their rights are routinely curtailed, and they are mostly denied citizenship, even where they, their parents or their grandparents were born in the country. Jordan is the sole exception. We call for the principle of civic equality for Palestinians to extend throughout the region, although I'm not sure we're very optimistic about its prospects for the immediate future. Previously, I alluded to a second possible international approach, originally elaborated in my 2009 pamphlet, Visions of the Endgame over there. This would also entail decisive international leadership, plus a robust enforcement mechanism that would not easily be derailed by the first atrocity or disrupted by the delaying tactics of any party. The proposed initiative would include participatory as well as coercive elements and comprise three main steps. First, there would be an invitation to the principal parties to tender their respective visions of the endgame, based on the international consensus of two states, by a fixed deadline of, say, 6 months. They've had many years to think about it, and it should not require more time than that. This request would put the ball firmly in their courts, concentrate their minds, and provide them with the opportunity to flesh out their rhetorical positions. In the second step, the international community would formulate the definitive plan to end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and resolve the wider Arab-Israel issues. This move would go ahead whether or not one or more of the parties declined to play ball at the first step or tried to procrastinate. Ideally, the international plan would be endorsed by the UN Security Council. The third step would be the implementation phase, comprising a schedule of bespoke interim targets for each party to achieve according to a fixed timetable en route to the final destination. Attached to every way station, as it were, would be a package of strong inducements that would reward implementation or penalise failure at every stage to each party. The proposal would not preclude bilateral negotiations. The parties would be free to agree any matter directly between themselves during the first two phases, extending over a period of roughly 1 year. Whatever they might agree would go into the definitive plan. What they failed to agree would be left to the international community to determine, meaning that the status quo, which invariably favours the occupying power, would no longer be the default position. Practical negotiations would also be necessary at the implementation stage once the parameters have been determined. The international body probably most suited to this task is the so-called Quartet, comprising the US, the UN Secretary-General's Office, the EU and Russia, possibly supplemented by the Arab Quartet, so-called, of Egypt and Jordan, both of which have diplomatic ties with Israel, plus Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, the UAE. Together with colleagues in the wake of the collapse of the bilateral talks, I have started again to promote this proposal, and we would be glad of any assistance in putting it around if you think it's worth the effort. Well, I hope that wasn't too incoherent, and I'm sure there was plenty there to disagree with. Inevitably, there are many areas and issues I have not touched on. Maybe some of them will be raised in the discussion session to follow, and I hope it will be a discussion session. Meanwhile, I should like to thank those of you who are still awake for, must be a few, for your attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony, for a very, very interesting and dynamic set of thoughts and proposals. Now, it's time for some questions. Maybe one coming from the front row, I'm not quite sure. Otherwise, there'll be plenty from elsewhere. Put your hands up, please, and then I will indicate you in appropriate order. And one or two. Yes, sir. And two at the back. One there. And wait to get the... And you will be third, and you will be fourth, sir. So say your questions clearly with the microphones turned on, but I try. I can hear that. Hang on. And then they'll be recorded and Dr. Klug will respond. By the way, when I welcomed you all, I forgot to welcome Paul and Marilyn Longton. Paul Longton is about to go out to Palestine in a peacekeeping capacity, from what I understand. Are you here? Yes. Well done. Thank you. I was told to make you welcome by camera. Good. Let's have our first question, please.
As I understand it, there are various Arab countries surrounding Israel who don't recognise Israel's right to exist. I also wonder if you could say something about the meeting which President Clinton organised some years ago, which is between the two sides. And as I understood it, they were about to accept some, peaceful agreement when Yasser Arafat withdrew at the last minute. I wonder if you could say something about that. And lastly, is my great hero Tony Blair going to help solve this problem?
I'll deal with the third question first. I believe the answer to the question is no. So I'll go on to the... I'm not sure what he's been doing there, but I think it's another one. It's a bit like the bilateral negotiations, when you put someone who, in my view, not just mine, is completely inappropriate for the job, you block someone else who might have actually been able to do something very effective. So I think it was a very bad decision to appoint him. I think it was George Bush who was repaying a favour to Blair for having supported him over Iraq. I don't see any other explanation. Anyway, the only thing he has done is taken up 1 or 2 floors of the American Colony Hotel, if any of you know it, in East Jerusalem. It's a lovely hotel. It's very annoying because you very often now can't get a room there. Because he's moved out. Oh, good, maybe I'll go back. But let me deal with the other questions. Israel's rights, which is, I alluded in my talk to the famous 3 no's of the Khartoum Arab Summit in, I think it was November 1967, either September or November, a few months after the 1967 war, when the Arab states met and they came out with a communique which was no peace, no negotiations, no recognition of Israel. And that was at a time when they had been heavily defeated and humiliated, and was in a way a natural response. But as the years went by, the Arab and the Palestinian denial of the reality of Israel was something which became very damaging to the Palestinian world and the Israeli and the Arab world. The reality of the state increasingly impressed itself on its neighbours. And as time went by, and for the first few years, the currents really were underground. You had to detect them. But increasingly the view came about, led by the Palestinians themselves, that you have to study this state. It's no good just pretending it isn't there and waiting for someone to come and liberate, and you return to your homes and all be hunky-dory again, as if it was ever really hunky-dory. So over the period from 1967 to 1973 and then carrying on to 1988, there were some Palestinians who started talking about aiming to have their state alongside Israel instead of Israel. 2, you may know the names which stand out: the Saeed Hamami, who was the PLO representative in the UK, and Issam Satawi, who was the PLO representative in Portugal, who started to be called moderates because they were calling for this formula, but they were no more moderate than they were previously. They militantly supported their people's cause, but they were ahead of the curve, and they recognised that there was only one way of getting their state, and that was next to Israel. They were both assassinated by fellow Palestinians who had not yet got to the same part of the curve. But what's significant about it is that it was a symptom of the way things were going. So by 1988, at the Congress in Algiers, the PLO was ready, and as I said earlier, after agonized internal debate over many years, to declare that they no longer sought the destruction of the Israeli state, but they were prepared to live alongside it in peace, provided they could use the West Bank and Gaza Strip as their state, with East Jerusalem as the capital. This was their great historical compromise, and it still rests on the table. Arab states caught up not long after that. You may remember there were the Oslo Accords in 1993, when the PLO formally recognized Israel and actually gave up the use of violence as a tool. And Israel formally recognized not Palestine, but the PLO. But it was believed to be the precursor to the two-state outcome. And had Yitzhak Rabin, the Israeli Prime Minister at the time, not been assassinated by a fanatical Jewish settler, it's speculative, but there is good reason to believe that he may well have seen it through, and before the turn of this year, at the turn of the century, that conflict may have been resolved. In 2002, under the Arab Peace Initiative, the commitment was to fully recognise Israel, to establish full peace and diplomatic relations with Israel, in exchange for Israel withdrawing from the territories captured in 1967 and the formation of a Palestinian state. That still remains on offer. Now, that's not to say there aren't some circles within the Arab world, within the Muslim world more widely, who still call for Israel's eradication. Formally, Hamas still does, although Hamas is not a homogenous body, and there's a pragmatic wing who also recognises more or less where the PLO was in 1988. But I think that idea of eradicating Israel by the Arab world really belongs to history. Psychologically, within Israel, it doesn't. And one thing, I'll say this by way of conclusion, I'm sorry I've gone on, that needs to be remembered is that when a people has been threatened with annihilation within living memory and seen it happen almost to the end, it's a little more sensitive to threats of annihilation, even if it's only hyperbole, than we in this country may be. If there was a threat to destroy Britain and its inhabitants, we wouldn't take it very seriously by Iran or by Hamas or Hezbollah. But it's a very, very sensitive issue in Israel. And friends of the Palestinians really need to help encourage them to understand that, but so many do today. We're living in quite a different era. Very briefly on Camp David, the Clinton-led negotiations in July 2000, that summit, it was put around that, I won't go into the details, if you want to see my long take on this, if you just Google my name and infernal scapegoat, the words infernal scapegoat, that's the article I wrote at the time. But in a nutshell, the generous offer was really not a generous offer. And the blaming of Arafat for the breakdown of those talks, in my view, was unfair and untrue. Not just in my view, I mean many people felt this, but it was put round by both the Americans and the Israelis that Arafat was to blame. And to this day, that view, as you can tell from the question, is still widely held. I think it was a real opportunity lost.
There was one there, and then I'm going to take Mr. Downey's, Councillor Downey's.
I'm not a councillor, but I was.
Oh.
Well, we'll do this at the end.
Yes, thank you very much. I will take Councillor Downey now. Next Councillor Downey.
Robert Klug, it strikes me that the no is actually now on the other foot. In other words, no recognition, no negotiation. And certainly, in my opinion, and from what I've heard and what I have seen in the 6 trips I've made in the last 2 years to Palestine, that actually the Likud area of Israel actually doesn't want any thought of giving up any land. And I don't see, frankly, how actually they will give up there. Now, you mentioned, I think it was 500,000 settlers. I think it's now closer to 700,000, according to what I was told. And that's why, to be honest, the feeling that I get is that actually it is now only one state, one possible state, because I cannot see a Gaza withdrawal happening on the West Bank. What I would also say is that actually one of the aspects that is critical is that Israeli friends of mine actually have no problem with Palestinians per se. You talked about the drift away from Likud and the extreme right, and I certainly believe that that is happening. But what I cannot see is actually where's the beef in actually persuading the Israelis in any way. At the present moment, they want to get on, the majority, with their own lives. And I'd like to know what you think and what can happen to actually persuade the power people to do actually what de Klerk did in South Africa when he was told by Oppenheimer that he had to, and when effectively Martin McGuinness and Paisley actually sat down and worked together. Which is why I actually think that one state, equal rights, would happen. And certainly what we are trying to do as far as the Bethlehem-Bath links, and we hope to extend it to, and we have loads of other West Bank cities who would like to do the same and find other places around Britain, is actually then to make it triangular, where actually the Israelis do realise that the Palestinians are human beings, and that the Palestinians actually know that not everybody is Likud.
Thank you. I was going to ask a similar, but as Chair I don't need to ask a question, but could I just add on to Peter Down is, where would they all go? I looked at a map of the West Bank, not that one, but I was looking for these maps to put up there, and I found one with about 200 or 300 settlements on it, little red dots. With 700,000 people, where would they all go to if Israel had to release those settlements from occupation? And that rather adds on to the psychosis behind your question, I think. Anyway, if you're able to say. And then I'll have other questions from the floor after you've given an answer.
Well, we can go into the details of where they might be able to go, but fundamentally it's a question of political will. If there were a will on the part of the Israeli government to have a deal based on 2 states, then there are formulae which are not that complicated. You've heard of the idea of land swaps. If Israel retained the areas just over the old Green Line, just over the old border between Israel and the West Bank, that would accommodate the overwhelming majority of the settlers. The others would. That's the vast majority often live in the blocks just over the Green Line.
You've got Hebron, you've got Jericho, you've got Geneva.
Yeah, they're all problems. There's also Nablus and there are many others we could mention, but I'm talking about you would accommodate the clear majority of them if the big blocks just over the Green Line were absorbed into Israel and there were an equitable land swap which went to the Palestinians. Now, not that much work has been done on where the land swap would take place to the Palestinians because it's not seriously on the agenda at the moment. How does it get on the agenda? Well, ultimately, it will be up to the Israeli population to elect a government which is ready to do that. How will that happen? I think I've tried to explain in my talk that it's basically down to international pressure, inducements, positive and negative, I don't think we should be talking just boycotts. I think we have to be talking incentives as well, to paint a picture whereby Israel would be, well integrated into the region and into the global community if it were ready to do a deal with the Palestinians. The idea that the one state in a way you could say it exists at the moment, in the sense that there is one government which is occupying the entire land. But you still have this fundamental question that I raised during my talk, which is that the Palestinians actually want their own state, and they want an Arab state. And the Jews want self-determination as well, and they want it to be a Jewish state. Now, you can sit on high or thousands of miles away and say, well, we've got a good idea, look, we have it in the UK. It's my state. I rather like democratic secular states. But you do not have the support for it at the grassroots among the people on either side. So the danger is, if you go for that, you will just be setting up a brand new conflict all over again. Where did the two-state idea come from in the first place? What was the problem? The problem was that each party wanted their own state. So the solution was the two states. The problem was they didn't want to live together in the same state, which denied them self-determination. Well, that's the problem. You can't put forward the solution, the problem as the solution.
One state is not my idea. It's actually a Palestinian idea. And there are books written about it. When I was first told about it by Professor Kumsei, Mazin, I said, what on earth are you going to call it? The Palestinians will never accept the name Israel, and the Israelis will never accept the name Palestine. And he said, actually, Canaan. The Canaanites were actually there first. And so, consequently, actually people can get on together. Prods can get on with Catholics, blacks can get on with whites, and Israelis can get on with Palestinians.
It's not the question of getting on together, it's the question of the structure. We can get on with the French, we can get on with the Scottish. The Scottish wanted independence, many of them wanted independence. They nearly got independence, right? But the Scots had full rights in the United Kingdom, full civil and political rights, but they wanted self-determination, and they might still get it yet. It's the structure which matters. It's not a question of whether you get on with each other. That's a notion which, and I know the book you're talking about, the Palestinian book. First of all, you say Palestinians say, yes, they do, a half a dozen of them. A dozen of them. It's a very, very small number of them. You can't pretend with these things. You've got to look at the bigger picture. We meet people who say all sorts of things, but you look at the bigger picture, there's almost no support for it. But if you look at that particular proposal that Kawasma is one of the supporters of, it's an Arab state. Now, he's an Arab. He's entitled to want an Arab state. Why shouldn't Palestinian Arabs want an Arab state? You can't pretend this is going to be a democratic, secular, non-sectarian state. That is not what is proposed. It is proposed that the Jews of Israel be allowed to stay there. Just one minute. We be allowed to stay there, which is a big jump from the PLO position originally, which would have expelled the vast majority of Jews who live there. That is no longer the position. But they will be there as individuals who have a religious identity as Jews. And you atomize society down to the individual rather than acknowledging the collective identities of people, which are very important to both the Palestinians and the Israelis. And you can't, by rhetoric, overcome that. I have shown that book that Kawasma and others have written to a few Israeli friends, and they said this is a nice way of calling for the eradication of the Israeli state, and we will fight it bitterly. But it's not really for you or I to have a strong opinion on that. We need to consult the people concerned, and I can guarantee you that will be the answer of 95% of them.
Martin,
So I think we need to move on.
I think we'd like to have another question. Now, there was a person at the back there. Yes, madam. Could I have the... Yes, the floor is yours.
Yes, I find it somewhat surprising that you have faith in the wisdom of the international community when dealing with the affairs of the Middle East. Do you not think that when the West interferes in the Middle East, the net result is often worse And as you say, we predicted things, we didn't understand things, we didn't understand what was going to go on. What has changed that we can now put our influence into the situation and hope for something good to come from our influence?
Well, it's a very good question, and I can't say I do have a lot of faith in the international community. I do think that they've screwed up over many, many years in the wider Middle East and in particular in relation to Israel-Palestine. For many years, I argued against Western interference, and the real breakthroughs came between the Israelis and the Palestinians and the Israelis and the Egyptians. The Egyptian-Israel peace accord, the Sadat initiative to fly to Jerusalem, was entirely an Egyptian initiative and an Egyptian-Israeli affair. The Americans only came in on that much later on down the road when the Israelis and the Palestinians couldn't agree some of the details. So there actually, the Americans played a very constructive role. Without them, I think it's fair to say that probably the Egyptian-Israeli treaty may not have been finalised. The Oslo Accords between the Israelis and the Palestinians, again, was an indigenous affair. It was entirely among Israelis and Palestinians. Secret negotiations went on for some months in Oslo, and they came out with the Oslo Accord, which was a great surprise to the Americans and others in the West. So my faith was always there that the people themselves will resolve the conflict. And if you had a different government in Israel, maybe that would still be possible. But as long as you've got the leadership of either party, whichever it happens to be, which is determined not to do a deal on the basis of the international consensus, with exceptions, and on the basis that still the vast majority of both Israelis and Palestinians support, then the only way in which that can change is by pressure coming from the outside. And that the pressure, it would be pressure, it wouldn't be policies. The policies of two states is something that has been agreed a long time ago among Israelis and Palestinians. It came from the inside. So they wouldn't be imposing their own policies, which I would be very much against because I'm sure that they would be dysfunctional. But it would be ensuring that those policies are implemented by applying pressure. And the default position, if they don't do that, is that nothing will happen at all, and we will continue as we are, and there will be perpetual conflict. I mean, I'm much more pessimistic in a way than others who think somehow you will have this utopian one state and we'll all forget all the differences. I don't think that will happen. I think there will be two states, as I've said earlier, but you might get it through a very nasty, violent conflict and end up with that. And to avoid that, I think international pressure is the only way. And applied in such a way that the Israeli population recognises they must return a government, if you like it, a Klug equivalent, that says enough of all this, that we must do the deal.
There was a person with a question down here, and then you next, madam. All right? I haven't forgotten you. Could we have the... Have you got the microphone there?
Yes.
Yes. Please put your question, please.
You mentioned the Oslo Accord as a fine step forward, but in fact, one of the most vital bits of the Oslo Accord was an agreement about water resource. So vital that I think that more Palestinians are dying of polluted water and inadequate water because 120 wells for the 4 aquifers have never been repaired or maintained. So there's been a very concerted effort by the Israeli army to actually pollute the systems which they try and provide for themselves or destroy them. So the water resource is something that's already causing great damage, and or the map water resource, and I wondered whether that is one of the key things that actually needs to be settled much sooner than waiting, a few years, because they're dying at the moment at a pretty horrific rate.
Well, the situation in the Gaza Strip is even more dire because a lot of the water base is being infiltrated by seawater. But it just underlines the urgency to resolve this conflict. I would have very little faith in the idea of resolving bits and pieces of it in advance. I'd be very happy if they agree to do that. But I think it has to be a comprehensive resolution, and comprehensive not just among Israelis and Palestinians, but comprehensive in the region. And I think it is perfectly realistic, given the 3 yeses now of the Arab world, for there to be a comprehensive arrangement, which may even appeal to a party like Klug, because there's a sort of informal alliance now between Israel and Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Egypt, largely in the face of what they all regard as the Iranian threat. But that alliance can only go so far as long as the Palestinian issue is not resolved. So there is an impetus there as well, even to a right-wing government, not the far right, but the slightly more sensible right, to recognise that if they really want to move into the new era of serious alliances with some of the states within the Arab world, then they have to end the Palestinian conflict.
Can we have the microphone for this lady here in sort of bluey green?
Not just Palestinians that are talking about ones. I understand your questions about the possibility of a one-state solution. Nobody's saying it would be easy, but it's not. For instance, Professor Ilan Pape has been a strong proponent of that solution for a long time. You've talked, so it wouldn't be easy, but what would be easy about a 2-state solution when you've got 2 blocks of land separated by Israel? You've got the Palestinians wouldn't have very much control over their own borders alongside Israel, and you've got you talk about people that want a Jewish state and the people that want an Arab state or a Muslim state or whatever. But the people that want a Jewish state, if you end up with a 2-state solution, remembering that you've already said that there are at least 20% of the Israeli population who are Palestinians, what happens to them? Because you will still be left with the same problem then, that those will be people with second-class rights or even worse in that land. And finally, you mentioned about land swap, giving some land to Israel for the land they've taken for the settlements, and that the Palestinians might have some. Well, the Palestinians have already lost. Why would we be giving the Israelis more and giving some kind of compensation to the Palestinians when the Palestinians have already had so much taken from them? And my other question related to that is, at the beginning of your talk, you talk about the Jewish people, the people that originated in this part of the world. But that's a myth, isn't it? There is no Jewish people. Whilst we are where we are, and the Palestinians and everybody else recognise that we have to find a way for these people to live together, and the Palestinians that I know are not saying that the Jewish people should go home, but go away. They haven't got anywhere else to go away. But to say that they originate in that land, it has no more legitimacy than to say that we, as the Christian people, perhaps, originate in that land.
You raise some serious issues, and I can't necessarily answer them all. I would say that there probably isn't a culture, a religion, a nation which isn't based on myths. The fact that things may be mythical doesn't make them any less real to the people who hold to those myths. So, you could have great experts who can disprove. There are at least as many books written on the non-existence of the Palestinian people as there are on the mythology of the Jewish people, or the British people for that matter. But if people perceive themselves as a people, perceive themselves as a nation, demand self-determination, or aspire to self-determination, have a history in common, see their future as a shared future, then it's not for us on the outside to say to these people, you are not a nation. There was an era where you had great intellects who were telling people what the real definition of a nation is.
But my point is we should be talking about the Israeli people, not the Jewish people. And the Israeli peoples can be...
Well, I'm not sure what I see that's part of the problem, what we should be talking about. I don't have a view on one state and two states. I mean, that may be the difference between us. My view is entirely determined by my understanding of what the people themselves want, right? And over close to 50 years of involvement, it is overwhelmingly obvious to me that both the Palestinians and the Israelis want their own state. And we can sit here and say, but how about a democratic secular state? They're really nice, and wouldn't you like one? And I think they're wonderful. I mean, I much prefer to live in one of those than any other desire. But it's a different part of the world. It's different thinking. It's a different culture. You've got to get on the inside of it. And there is not support for that. I was up against, I've known about Pepe for many, many years. And I was up against him recently, a few months ago. And he said, well, I'm going to stick to my proposal of one state, even if it takes 150 years. 150 years? 150 years more of living in refugee camps? 150 years, that's 5, 4, 5, 6 generations of the Palestinian identity being diluted and diluted, so that people will be 1/50th, 1/40th Palestinian. This is a problem that has to be addressed and resolved now. If there were two states, I don't underestimate the difficulties of it, and you could have a Benelux type of arrangement. To me, it's a sort of a mania to say you have to eliminate states. Why? You can have them as close as Benelux, where they've still retained their three states, their independent states. And if you look around the world, that's not the way things are going. I mean, I've heard it said it is, but it's not. You know, Eritrea became independent of Ethiopia. South Sudan became independent of Sudan. Kosovo became independent of Serbia. East Timor became independent of Indonesia, and we can go on around the world. The Soviet Union divided into 15 states, Yugoslavia divided into 6, and then subdivided again, and so it goes on. It's not unnatural that people identify with their group of people and want to have self-determination. I don't say that as an advocate of it, I say that merely as an observer of it. And if we are determined to deny what is a clear reality, and we paint a pretty picture of how things could be, well, that's very
But that's
fine.
really my question, because you know the pretty picture is the two states, one Jewish, one not.
But you're saying...
What happens to the 20% of...
Well, they stay. Every state has its minority. There's absolutely no reason why that shouldn't continue. And in fact, I think myself it would be a very good idea if many of the settlers stayed within the Palestinian state, and that they had their minority. I don't think a pure Palestinian state would be anything more to commend than a pure Jewish state. They will both have their minorities, but fundamentally, the Palestinian state would be the state in which the Palestinian Arab people exercises its self-determination, which seems to be a fundamental aspiration, and the Israeli state would be the state in which the Israeli Jewish people exercises its self-determination, but there will be minorities in both states. It just seems to me that's still far more plausible an outcome, even if you and I might actually feel that it's not desirable, but desirable from whose point of view. I think there's a great danger. I also think that a lot of damage has been done with the one-state advocacy. It comes back to a previous question, because the Kurd and the settlers have got away with it for so many years because there was no pressure coming from the outside. And one of the reasons why the pressure was reduced is a lot of people got onto the one-state band. If you're supporting one state, then you're not opposing the settlements. you're not opposing the annexations. It doesn't matter because it's all going to be one state. So it undermined the campaign to end the occupation and to end the states. And this is one of the reasons why I think it's actually damaging this argument, which I don't think is going to go anywhere.
We're going to have time for, we're running late, we have to stop at past. I'll take a question there, a question here, whoever that is it you? Yes? Well, one or other of you, I can't take both. And the last one will be that lady on the end there. And then I'm afraid we've got to stop. It's very sad, we could go until 10, but we can't.
Maybe half our MPs voted to recognise
Could you please stand up and speak up a little bit? Is your microphone turned on?
I'll do it without, I prefer to do it without that if I can.
Is the microphone turned
Our
on?
MPs voted.
Is the microphone turned on?
Yes.
It's all right.
Can I carry on?
Put your question to the microphone, thank you.
Nearly half our MPs voted to recognise a Palestinian state. It wasn't binding on our government, which has what I think is a slightly more ambiguous view. I wondered whether you think...
Hold the microphone up, please.
Could you hold your microphone up, please? Speak into the microphone. Put the microphone up to your face, please. Thank you.
I wonder
Up.
do you mind if I just carry on? Thank you. I just wonder whether there's any specific action you think our new government might take in relation to the Palestinian-Israeli issue.
Thank you.
I hope you've heard.
You're talking about the vote by the UK Parliament a couple of months ago in support. It was overwhelming.
Yes.
There were only a few number who voted against, although a large number did stay away. Personally, I think these are very good campaigns. They're taking place all over Europe. Only one government so far in Western Europe has actually endorsed a Palestinian state at this stage, and that's Sweden. But quite a number of parliaments have. And it's an ongoing campaign. It's supported strongly by the Palestinians themselves. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a group of Israelis who are actually doing some brilliant work, because what they're doing is every time they hear there's a vote coming up, they send a letter signed by, I think it's more than 1,000 of them now, arguing in favour of the Parliament supporting the resolution and saying that it's very much in Israel's interest as well as in the Palestinians' interest, and that has swayed quite a number of votes. So I think it's an important campaign. It's again something which has only happened because bilateral negotiations have broken down and all these ideas have come up. I just want to add one thing to what I said earlier in relation to a number of the questions, and that is, Israeli society is much more powerful economically, socially, dynamically than Palestinian societies. People have spoken about, Israelis have prevented the Palestinians from developing their own economy. Well, you see, this is among the dangers of one state. If you had one state, you wouldn't have a Palestinian economy. If there were a proposal to merge Saudi Arabia and Yemen, because why not? I mean, Yemen's right next door, and you would overwhelm Yemen by Saudi Arabia. You would overwhelm Mexico by the United States. I don't get the argument for overwhelming the Palestinians by a much, much more powerful Israeli state. Palestinians need to develop their own society, need to develop their own economy. They need to be protected from Israel in doing that. There may come a stage where they can have much closer relations and maybe even merge ultimately. But I think the only way you'd ever get to one state, assuming that's desirable, is actually by going through the two-state phase beforehand. I don't think there's any shortcut.
Thank you. Now, one of you two gentlemen has the microphone.
I've got the
You're
microphone.
the winner.
Is that right?
Let's have your question, sir. And then after that, it's the lady on the corner there.
I'd like to ask you what you consider to be the importance of the so-called Israeli lobby in America. My experience of the United States is that the Jewish community is actually quite small, And the so-called Israeli lobby is a fundamental Christian lobby. I mean, it's very powerful. Could you give us some thoughts as to whether you think it has a serious influence on the future of either the federal state or the two-state solution?
It's a very interesting question. It's quite a big question. I attended a meeting only a few days ago, which was addressed by a Palestinian expert on this matter, among others. And he used exactly your phrase. He said it's a complete misnomer to think that it's a Jewish lobby. It's an Israel lobby, supported by the Klug and the right. But it comprises a relatively small number of American Jews and a relatively large number from the evangelical Christian community. The Jewish population in America, according to opinion polls, support the two-state idea by roughly 78%, whereas the Israel lobby, as it were, is doing everything it possibly can to hold up that ultimate resolution. And there's a difference, there's a fundamental difference in approach, because as far as the evangelical lobby is concerned, it's not a matter of what is the best way to resolve the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. There is a strong religious ideological commitment that the Jews must return to the land of Israel. And until that happens, the Messiah will not return. So this is a precondition for that. Once they all return, there will be what they call the rapture. And at that point, the Jews will have to choose between either converting to Christianity, the true religion of Christianity, or perishing. So, in a sense, although this is a very strong pro-Israel lobby, it's ultimately very, very anti-Semitic. And I once put this to a right-wing Israeli politician. I said, you know, what do you think about that? That in the end, you're going to have to convert or perish. And his response is, well, we'll worry about that.
Can we have a microphone to the lady on the edge there? Could you put your hand up, madam? Paul's coming to you. And this, I'm afraid, is going to have to be, that's all right with you, Tony, our last lined-up question. Thank you.
Well, I would like to thank you very much, Dr. Klug, because you put a bit of optimism in my heart after the election, sorry, I'm here. I was terribly depressed, but having read your figures, it seemed that there is a bit of hope and silver lining, the way, that's the expression you used. But my question to you is this one. Whatever happens in the future, is any group of politicians in Israel going to be able to face Hamas and negotiate with Hamas? Or would they rather have Mahmoud Abbas? Or what is your view on that? I mean, because there is firm dissension between those two sides. So, could you please give me some hope on that? Or maybe you'll be able to see a silver lining on this particular issue. Thank you.
I don't really see it as my role to give people hope. But if you can extract some from what I say, then I'm very happy. Hamas is not a homogenous organisation. It's not a monolith. There are elements of Hamas who are completely dedicated to their charter, which is not just a call for the destruction of Israel, but it's also deeply anti-Semitic in the old sense of the Tsarist and you would say even Nazi type of anti-Semitism. It's really atrocious. But I've been assured by Hamas, fairly senior Hamas people I know, that the Hamas Charter was more or less designed by one person many years ago in the very early stages and very little attention was paid to it, and it more or less went through on the nod. Now they're sort of stuck with it and find it problematic to try and change it. I don't think it's a very good excuse, and I've actually said to them, well, there may come a time when the Western world is ready to recognise Hamas and talk to it seriously. And as soon as that happens, what the Charter says will be publicised and will undermine any such advance. And now's a good time to change it. And there was a sort of recognition that there was some validity in that argument, but they felt that it was more or less impossible to do so. So there is that wing, and there's the militant, the military wing. But there are a lot of very pragmatic people among Hamas. Hamas won the election in 2006, not because the Palestinian population dropped their support for Fatah's two-state policy and mutual recognition and a peaceful settlement, and took up what, at least at the time, was Hamas's strong position of one Islamic state and the eradication of Israel. But they voted for Hamas mainly because Fatah had not delivered the goods. They'd been saying for years, we will negotiate a two-state solution, and they hadn't managed to do so. When I say that, I'm not saying that in order to attribute full blame for them by any means. I think that the blame in some proportion belongs to both them and Israel. And I think a lot of it actually belongs to Israel, in my view, because it has been turning its back on two states for quite a long time. But put it this way, if Israel were to put on the table tomorrow the equivalent of the Arab Peace Initiative, they put an Israeli Peace Initiative, which called for more or less the same thing as the Arab Peace Initiative. In other words, full peace, full diplomatic relations, full travel, full trading, in exchange for a Palestinian state on the West Bank and Gaza. The whole of Palestinian politics, maybe not overnight, but in a short period of time, would be transformed. And those calling for the eradication of Israel, I believe, would be sidelined very, very quickly. But there's nothing on the table which is on offer for them. And until then, people will still be very dismissive. It was a similar thing with the PLO. The Hamas today is in a similar position to the PLO then. But when there was a prospect of an agreement, the PLO changed its policy. I don't say there's a total identity, but I think there needs to be a fluidity, there needs to be new currents. And in order to have that, there needs to be a new initiative. And really that needs to come from Israel. Just before I finish, there was a part of the question here that I haven't quite completed, and I just want to mention it. That there is also, there's another lobby you may know about in America called J Street, which is, if you like, a much more dovish, and that is predominantly Jewish lobby. And it calls itself pro-Israel, pro-peace, pro-Palestinian. The literature doesn't quite say pro-Palestinian, but I attended one of their congresses, and the director was very clear that we are pro-Palestinian, pro-Israeli, pro-peace. And although they say they're not opposed to AIPAC, which is the major pro-Israel lobby, in reality, their policies are very different from it. And there are many, many groups. There's a group called Jewish Voice for Peace. There's the New Israel Fund, which is active here and very strongly in the United States. When it's encapsulated or encapsulated as there is a Jewish lobby, and the Jewish lobby is against a settlement between the Israelis and Palestinians, it's a total distortion of the reality. This is what this Palestinian guy was saying at this talk that he gave the other day that I attended. And it's very refreshing to hear that, because the lady there would like me to give hope, but a lot of people spend their time doing exactly the opposite, telling you why there are so many obstacles, why there won't be peace, or the peace they describe as some fantasy, which would never happen. It's really important to try and understand, without fear or favour, without mythologies, what the realities are. And I've tried to do that this evening. I don't say that I have necessarily cracked the egg, but that's my endeavour. And I hope that I've made some contribution to the thinking of this topic, and thank you very much.
To wind this up, we've had a most thoughtful, difficult evening of these imponderables and these ghastly logjams. And I just want to say that I think our speaker, I thought I had a loud voice, but here we go. I want to say that we've had an evening of wonderful dissertation on the ghastly logjams in which the Middle East is cursed at the present time. Our speaker has helped us see through these ghastly lumps of concrete in a most inspired and clear manner. And as he and others amongst our audience this evening are engaged in this process of trying to bring reason out of disagreement, we're most obliged for the thought you put into writing this talk, which I know is very fresh off the block. It started a week ago. It's absolutely up to the minute, absolutely to the point. Thank you very much, Tony, for a most intriguing evening. Thank you. Don't forget, all of you who would like to participate